Auteur theory is perhaps the most influential film theory ever written, one that has impacted every facet of cinema, and one that is riddled with controversies. But I think a lot of approaches to discussing and thinking about auteur theory are wrong or misinterpret what the concept is truly talking about. It ends up being muddled down to an auteur director being just a competent director that is also an egomaniac who thinks they're the sole artist, which is not true at all. Auteur theory, like the francophonic name implies, developed in France in the 1950s from the French film critics in the Cahiers du Cinéma. Don't talk about my French. A French film magazine. One of the founders of the magazine, André Bazin, wrote that the director's personal vision should be on display in the film. This concept led to the legendary Francois Truffaut to write his ideas about this concept, and auteur theory was born. Truffaut and his writing contemporaries were extremely critical of French cinema at the time, denoting it as stale, formulaic, and artistically minimal. Truffaut would cite the famous American directors as examples of a better cinematic industry, naming John Ford and Alfred Hitchcock as examples. Through their disdain for current French cinema, the answer would be to focus on director-led projects. Auteur, which simply means author in French, describes a director with a clear artistic vision for their films. One with a visionary style where you can tell the director just by viewing parts of the film. Auteur theory suggests that the director should be the sole artist of the film, and the other members of the crew are there to fulfill the artistic vision of the director. Thinking about film in this way can be hard, considering one of the biggest criticisms of auteur theory is that it undermines the importance of the other artists involved in making a film. Obviously, the director is not the only artist on set, and some view auteur theory as a way to minimize all of the collaborations between artists that goes into making a movie. This is a fair first reaction to the idea of auteur theory, but I think thinking about film as a singular art form rather than a collection of art forms is imperative to understanding auteur theory. Film is much more than the sum of its parts, and the director is what combines everything into a singular piece of art. Yes, film is made up of individual parts like cinematography, set design, editing, and such, but the quality of the film should not be additive of these aspects, but rather a merger of them without clear distinctions between the aspects. A film is an artistic, emotional experience, and that experience is a singular one. So although multiple aspects go into making a film, the singular piece of art is an individual creation from the director. Auteur theory changed the landscape of cinema, ushering in arguably the two most influential film movements of all time, the French New Wave and the New Hollywood movement. The French New Wave sprouted out of the film magazine and its writers, particularly Francois Truffaut and Jean Luc Godard, and was actually started by the incomparable Agnes Varda. The movement is associated with the writers trying to change the modern French film scene, injecting more experimentation with editing and visual style, as well as focusing on existential and political themes rather than appealing solely to the common denominator audience member. The French New Wave was held up by auteur theory, having some of the most well-known auteurs be prevalent members, such as Eric Rohmer, Agnes Varda, Jean-Luc Godard, Jacques Rivette. These directors used a profound and focused artistic vision to create immense works of art, rather than just products that are filmed. When Truffaut was writing about auteurism, he made a distinction between the screenwriters and the directors, pointing out that many modern directors were simply filming what was on the script, rather than producing their own vision of the film. If you give the same script to Alfred Hitchcock and to John Ford, you would get two completely different movies with different themes and different contexts because those directors put aspects of themselves into their work. Whereas if you give two of the non-auteur filmmakers Truffaut critiques the same script, you'll get essentially the same movie. Auteur theory was a new concept at the time despite using it to describe the old masters, so there was a small disconnect between the old masters and the eager new generation of artistically inclined youths. Peter Bogdanovich, a man who would become a great auteur himself, was an avid fan of the previous directors and would interview them as if they were great artists, despite directors like John Ford thinking of themselves more as tradesmen rather than artists. I think that this shows an inherent artistic value to cinema, as even if you don't approach it in this artistically inclined way, if you are an auteur, your voice and vision shines through in your craft in the form of art. This also signifies a big distinction between the generations. The first generation of filmmakers weren't necessarily cinephiles. mostly because there weren't even that many films made. I have seen more films than Georges Méliès had when he made A Trip to the Moon, but then this generation of filmmakers established the film canon, creating essentially the first generation of cinephiles. These young and hungry cinephiles leaned into auteur theory, noticing that even if unintentional, the directors that fit the mold of an auteur were the ones that made the most profound art. This new generation came to a point in the 1970s and changed American cinema forever with the New Hollywood movement. The New Hollywood movement is the pinnacle of auteurism and probably the group of directors most associated with it besides the French New Wave. The New Hollywood movement can often be seen as the American counterpart to the French New Wave. It was a group of auteurs that changed the stale landscape of cinema by introducing more experimentation with their style and by injecting a youthful viewpoint and politics into their film. The New Hollywood movement had some directors you may have heard of, like Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, George Lucas, Francis Ford Coppola, and Brian De Palma. The New Hollywood movement came out of a multitude of factors, including the lack of the Hays Code censoring Hollywood, the growing political climate and influence of the counterculture, the dissolution of the classic studio system, and of course the influence of auteur theory. Like I said, this is the first generation of cinephiles that have old masters to learn from, and their understanding and practice of auteur theory made them become the directors with some of the most distinct styles. During the New Hollywood movement, auteur theory actually influenced the economics of the industry. These new auteurs were used in marketing with their names on the posters themselves. Previously in Hollywood, the poster would focus much more on the producers, production companies, and stars of the film as the main draw. There were a few directors who would be listed prominently, but coincidentally, they are the ones we retroactively call auteurs now, like Frank Capra, Alfred Hitchcock, and John Ford. But now in the 70s, it is known as Steven Spielberg's Empire of the Sun, not just Empire of the Sun. These auteurs became household names. Even people who are casually into film know who Steven Spielberg and George Lucas are. However, the use of auteurism in marketing and widespread understanding of household name directors fell out of favor for a couple of reasons. Some say it starts with Jaws in 1975 being the first blockbuster, issuing in the capitalist industry of the studio system that had previously been dissolved. Some people would argue that it started in 1977 with the release of Star Wars, being the precursor for the modern franchise-based filmmaking. George Lucas is named among the New Hollywood directors, but Lucas didn't even direct the second and third installments of the franchise. The Star Wars movies are fantastic, but they definitely don't uphold the auteur theory's values. The landscape of franchise filmmaking started with the success of Star Wars and can be seen as part of the reason why modern audiences don't view filmmaking through auteurism. Another moment that impacted the auteurism of the 1970s is the release of Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate. Michael Cimino was an auteur who was on top of the world after his Oscar-winning film The Deer Hunter. After the major success of that, the studio gave Cimino a blank check for his next film, which he spent on the ravishingly expensive Heaven's Gate, having a budget of $44 million. The film was released and is one of the most famous box office bombs of all time, grossing $3.5 million, not even a tenth of its budget. The film almost bankrupted the studio and is often seen as the end of the New Hollywood movement. After the failure of Heaven's Gate, studios were no longer interested in trusting artists to make their director-led films. Instead, the studios focused on high-concept blockbusters like Jaws and Star Wars to make money. There are absolutely auteurs today, particularly Christopher Nolan, Denis Villeneuve, and Jordan Peele, but they don't have the same cultural impact and prowess that the auteur-focused industry of the 70s had. Today, the majority of films are marketed for franchises and sequels, remakes, and reboots. Going back to Heaven's Gate, this is to prevent disastrous bombs. Particularly with the MCU, auteurism is completely out the window. Kevin Feige tends to hire younger directors who don't have as much power in the industry so that they can make a bunch of money but have no real control over the final product. That's why so many of these films lack distinction within their directorial style. Some do, particularly Thor Ragnarok, directed by Taika Waititi, the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy by James Gunn, and Eternals by Chloe Zhao. The MCU is dictated by Kevin Feige, not the directors. They craft the story and direction based off of a producer's eyes and a money-making eye, not an individual vision. Some people would argue that any director is an auteur, and that auteur theory simply describes the role of the director, but I disagree. I think there are subjective criteria to meet to be an auteur, and I believe people can debate about certain directors. but I doubt anyone would have a strong argument that John Watts is an auteur. But here's the thing about the criteria for being one. I don't think it means you have to be a good director. Obviously, because being a good director is heavily subjective, but also because I don't think the purpose of auteur theory is just to talk about the best directors. I think it's a way to think about film in a more analytical and meaningful way, so there are absolutely auteur directors that I don't think are very good. For instance, I think Robert Rodriguez is a perfect example of an auteur, partially because of his vigor for making movies, doing so on shoestring budgets and taking up multiple roles in order to get them made. His debut film was made for $7,000 and is the lowest budget movie to make over $1 million. And despite some of his films like Spy Kids and Shark Boy and Lava Girl not being high art necessarily, they still employ a person's singular artistic vision. Same with directors like Michael Bay and Zack Snyder, who I don't hold in super high regard, but there is no doubt in my mind that these are both auteurs with distinct styles. There are a lot of criticisms towards auteur theory, the prominent one being that it discredits the artist making the film outside of just the director. And again, it's important to think about auteur theory not as a way to stroke the egos of these directors, but instead it's a way to think of films thematically and in the context of their creations. Another criticism of auteur theory, which I can actually agree with, is that it creates the in-group of film canon directors, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but these sorts of in-groups usually don't include women or non-Western directors. When people discuss auteurs, they always mention Jean Luc Godard and Martin Scorsese, but they leave out Claire Denis and Agnes Varda. They discuss Francis Ford Coppola and John Ford, but not Lynn Ramsey or Cassie Lemons. Creating this film canon leads to other unique approaches to film not being held to the same regard, and also for people of minority groups to be cast out in the discussion. I don't think this criticism is so much on auteur theory itself, but rather on film criticism as a whole, lacking the nuance and widespread global discussion that it deserves. So I don't think it is a complete discredit of auteur theory, but it is an important acknowledgement for improving the discussion of it in the future. Auteur theory changed the landscape of cinema in many ways. It improved the approach that both studios and audiences had to the art form, particularly in the French New Wave and New Hollywood movement. And it also helped solidify film into an art form rather than a simple trade. I think that the modern film scene would improve greatly from the reintroduction or reinvigoration of auteur theory into the public conscious because of the stale state of franchise filmmaking. A focus on our modern directors like Guadagnino, Ramsey, Ducournau, and Jordan Peele can reinvent the artistically inclined industry of the 1970s. I hope more people are able to grasp the importance of auteur theory and not write it off as an ego trip for the directors. Because even though egotistical directors are a nuisance, having director-led cinema is the best course of action to bring out the greatest in the art form.